In 1957, when Jawaharlal Nehru visited Japan, one of the outcomes of that visit was that India and Japan started a dialogue process which was not a government dialogue, but was quasi-official. It was what we would today call a track 1.5 process. On the Japanese side, it was, I think, one of the Japanese industrial organizations that took the lead. On the Indian side, it was the Planning Commission. And that was a wonderful idea, which frankly withered away. It didn't lead anywhere because the dialogue got stuck on the question that Japan kept asking. Can India promise, can India guarantee that it will not nationalize foreign investments? Now, no country can give a prospective guarantee of that kind. Nobody knows what may happen a year, 2 years, 5 years down the road. And frankly, it didn't lead to anywhere. But there was really the driving force of that group. The original concept was a sharing of ideas, a sharing of information. And imagine, Jawaharlal Nehru thought that Japan was the country with which India should start this. Not the Soviet Union, not the United States, nor any other country, nor China for that matter. Okay. If it comes to domestic governance, we have great pioneers, the founders of, among the founders of the institute are giants of the stature of Manu Mohanty. And Manu is a personal witness to how the institute began. And he will recall, and he does recall, that a study of China's domestic governance was one of the objectives, one of the core objectives from the outset. So in a sense, we are going back to our roots when we carry out this first effort at looking at some dimensions of China's domestic governance. Now, domestic governance is a huge subject, and we can hold any number of conferences and there will still be issues relating to domestic governance that we have not explored. But we are extremely fortunate that we have found a partner in India, a worthy partner, the Center for Policy Research, CPR for short. CPR has worked on domestic governance in India for some decades now, and they have done extraordinarily important work across the board. Perhaps Partha will tell us a little bit about it when he takes the floor immediately after me. I don't want to say too much about what we are going to examine, except to mention a couple of points. One is that China is a country that has many ideas, many ways of doing things that we can examine, not necessarily to imitate them, perhaps to use them even as negative examples in certain situations, or to see if there are elements in the Chinese way of working which might help illuminate our own path. And this is not easy to discern. And that is why this conference takes place. And this is why some of the issues we will consider will be perhaps a little bit complicated and a little bit, shall we say, not easy to fathom. But in essence, just imagine, we, India and China, are two vast countries in Asia, immediate neighbors, launched on the path to national renewal, national economic progress, almost at the same time, because we gained our independence and liberation. The one called it independence, the other called it liberation, almost at the same time, within 2 years of each other. Today's China is very different from India. We are a democracy, a practicing democracy where voters choose governments in and out of office. China is a dictatorship of the proletariat, as they call it, or a dictatorship of the Chinese Communist Party. And under President Xi Jinping, the Chinese Communist Party has become more central to the process, which was always a process of joint jumelage, a certain twinning between the state institutions and the party institutions, but with the party in prominence. These are some of the issues that we will examine during the course of these 2 days. I am grateful to all my friends at the Institute for the work they have put in, the huge effort they have put in organizing this conference, but there will be time at the end of the conference to say a big thank you to all of them. Let me very warmly welcome you to this conference and hope that it gives you ideas, it gives you some leads that might be of interest to you, and it may open the door to fresh thinking and fresh examination of India's own challenges. And this is where CPR comes in as our valuable partner. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Rana, for your very insightful remarks. I think Ambassador Rana has already done an excellent job at introducing the conference and the session and what we're going to be focusing on during the 2 days of the first iteration of the conference on domestic governance. Nonetheless, I shall try to fill in his shoes and reintroduce the conference in a formal manner. So once again, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi, I warmly welcome you to the inaugural session of the first iteration of our flagship conference on domestic governance. The conference is being organized by ICS in partnership with the Center for Policy Research, New Delhi. I, Anushka Saxena, am working with ICS as a research intern, and I shall be facilitating the session further. So the governance debate in China, as Ambassador Rana rightfully highlighted, features many crucial aspects of intermingled relationships between the society, the party state, and the economy. The first conference on China's domestic governance unravels this debate by exploring the Marxist-Leninist nature of the Communist Party of China and its relationship, or rather its conflation, with the Chinese state, the economic, scientific, and technological development, civil-military relationships, subnational governance, and the domestic imperatives of China's foreign policy. The various panels of the conference present a nuanced understanding of each issue, the implicit challenges, and likely impacts on the future trajectory of China's politics. We hope that this conference turns out to be as interactive and insightful for our speakers and audiences as it was for the team at ICS to organize. Without further ado, before I hand over the floor to Dr. Partha Mukhopadhyay, allow me to introduce our two eminent panelists for the inaugural session. As we already heard, Ambassador Kishan Rana is an Emeritus Fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi, and Emeritus Professor at DiploFoundation, Malta and Geneva. Ambassador Rana has an MA in Economics from St. Stephen's College, Delhi. He joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1960 and served in the Indian Embassy in China for 2 stints. He was the Indian Ambassador to Algeria, Czechoslovakia, Kenya, Mauritius, and Germany, and served on Prime Minister Indira Gandhi's staff as well. A polyglot, he speaks Chinese and French in addition to English and Hindi. Also joining us is Dr. Partha Mukhopadhyay, who is an Honorary Fellow, Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi, as well as Senior Fellow, Center for Policy Research, New Delhi. He joined CPR in 2006. He was previously part of the founding team at the Infrastructure Development Finance Company, focusing on private participation in infrastructure. In previous positions, he has been with the Exim Bank of India and with the World Bank in Washington. The complete bios of our speakers can be perused in the conference brochure on our website, and I shall also be sharing the same on the chat box. Before I hand over the floor to Dr. Mukhopadhyay, I request the audience to follow some housekeeping rules. All participants are requested to stay muted during the presentation, and if there are any comments, they can be posted in the chat box at any time during the event. The proceedings of this session will be recorded and live streamed on the ICS YouTube channel. So once again, my heartfelt gratitude to Ambassador Rana for kickstarting the inaugural session with such zeal and insight. I now invite Dr. Mukhopadhyay for his remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those remarks, and thank you so much, Ambassador Rana, for your opening remarks, which included CPR. The CPR, first, let me begin by offering Yamini Aiyar's apologies that she has not been able to be here with us today. She had very much planned to be here, but has at the last minute been held up by exigent circumstances. And as far as CPR is concerned, we are absolutely delighted to partner with the Institute for Chinese Studies on this particular issue especially. And given the fact that, as we just heard, I do have an affiliation with the ICS too, as do other members at CPR, and this has been the case for a long time. So in some senses, we've had a shared intellectual engagement, and it's nice to now fructify this as a conference event. Let me begin briefly where Ambassador Rana sort of left off, which is the issue of democracy. And it was a thing that sort of, when I first started engaging with China in the mid-2000s, it's one of the issues that sort of engaged me as to, and the question is, to what extent is the difference in political cultures attributable to the difference in economic and social outcomes? And that, in some sense, I think, is the way I look at it, is a nub of what we are trying to do today, is parse the separate elements that lead to differences in outcomes across our two very large nations. Because it's way too simplistic and facile, and which many scholars outside of ICS often do, is in doing India-China comparisons to say, oh, they're incomparable because they have very different political systems. But it's not the case that there's really too much of a difference between effect that political cultures have and whether or not you would have an underpass in a particular road and the way things are designed. So the trick is to try and understand how these differences in decision-making of those who make governance decisions affect the kind of choices they make, and how these affects choices across the various fields it will be covering in the conference, whether issues relating to civil-military relations, issues relating to structures of domestic governance across some things like health and education, issues relating to structures relating to economic policy, and kind of structures that have the Beijing consensus versus the Washington consensus, and what we have tried to do so far. So there is, in the way we approach technology policies, so to what extent can we attribute these kinds of differences to these differences in political culture? And if not, then what is it that we can, as large nations, learn from each other? So that is the crux of the engagement. Historically, unfortunately, both these, as the recent books, for example, by Ambassador Shyamsaran, was also again both associated with ICS and with CPR's points out, using that effugative praise of negative, the structure is to try and understand how these two large countries have perceived each other, and it's often the case that we have invested relatively limited resources in learning about each other from their own perspective. And it's often been the case that we have looked at only bilateral relationships and not even how perhaps we are engaging with third parties separately. And we are finding out, let's say, in our neighborhood in Sri Lanka, for example. So it is in that context that we at CPR are incredibly excited to be part of this conference and hope that as the discussions come through and the papers come to fruition, this will sort of culminate in a volume that would be of interest to a large number of people, and hopefully even more so, perhaps just the start of a long series that would take place on examining domestic governance in both our countries in the future as sort of a regular symposium that happens over time. So with that, let me add my words of welcome to the participants from the Center for Policy Research, and I look forward very much to the deliberations that will happen over the course of today and tomorrow. Thank you so much.
Thank you kindly, Dr. Mukhopadhyay, for your remarks. With this, we come to a very fruitful ending to the inaugural session of the first conference on domestic governance. I express my sincere gratitude to Ambassador Rana and Dr. Mukhopadhyay for their remarks and for any comments and suggestions and for addressing any comments and questions that the audience may have. I also express my sincere gratitude to the audience for tuning into our inaugural session. We at ICS have a robust 2-day schedule planned for the first CDG, and details of the same are highlighted in the brochure and the program available on the ICS website, as well as shared in the chat box here. We hope you will find time to also attend our next session on subnational or local governance in China, set to commence at 2 p.m. IST. Thank you so much.
I have a thought. Since we have a little bit of dead time, 8 minutes or so, and we have an active audience, and we know that we will go directly into the next session, can we have space for people to come in and make their own comments if they wish, or a question for the next 7 minutes or so, so that the audience has a sense of participation in the event. Anuksha, do you think this can be permitted?
Sure. Of course, Ambassador. We can throw open the floor to the audience for any questions or comments that that they may want to pose to you as well as to Dr. Mukhopadhyay.
No,
I think
I would much rather treat this as an opportunity to say their own piece, give their views. I don't think I'm in a position to answer questions right now, but it would be nice to hear from people on what they think about this idea of looking at domestic governance and maybe attempting as best as we can an India-China comparison. For example, I know that my good friend Subrata Mitra has carried out research on this subject, actually, on comparative studies. Maybe Subrata would like to jump in with a comment or two, or anyone else. Manu is another person who is deeply thought about these issues.
Sure.
Good morning, Ambassador Rana. If I may jump in, as you said, I am an interloper in this August company, and I owe it to you, and I also owe it to Professor Manoranjan Mahanti, Manoranjan Bhai, as we called him, as a student in Delhi University all the way back. He's the one who taught us Chinese studies. I went to India, of course, but always had a little inkling that we had something to do with China. So later, much later, when I was at Tsinghua University as a visiting professor and spent a day in a Chinese village, I remember Manoranjan Bhai's work and could see at first hand what power does, what accountability is about, and what a village can do by itself for itself. It has set my mind forever that this big Chinese wall that we have around China has to be broken, and Kautilya would have understood it because he said, friends you can ignore, enemies you must try to understand properly. So I'm very grateful that you have taken this initiative, and it moves me, sir, from all this distance to see how much goodwill can achieve by the way of contribution to knowledge. In our panel, I'll talk a little about why we must compare the so-called uncomparables and what kind of knowledge you can gain from it. But thank you very much for asking me. I am most grateful.
Manu, would you like to come in and say a word or two, please? Or anyone else? I mean, the floor is yours.
So there is a comment from Amit Dogra, if you would like to come in.
Yes,
I think I'll be happy to.
Can I read it out?
Yes,
Amit
yes.
asks how China's domestic governance of minorities like Uyghurs and Tibetan nomads are placed in China's meta-narrative around achieving China's dream and one China policy. Well, that's a very sharp, very pointed question. I think it's a question that none of us, at least among the Indians in this group, can possibly answer. It really relates to how China sees itself. But really, these are just an off-the-cuff remark. Would anyone like to come in and comment on that? Anyone at all? Ashok Kant, our former director and a man who has profound knowledge of China, contemporary China. Ashok, would you like to make a comment or two, please? And while we are thinking, there is a question from Dr. Mamadev Sigdel, which says, how China and India should respond to Sri Lanka's economic crisis. Another big, big question.
Ambassador Rana, I think since we have 3 minutes left for our next session. And,
did you want to take the floor? Did you want to say something?
Ambassador Rana, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
So this is Anushka. Sir, as we have only 2.5 minutes before our next session begins, I think our audience and experts are better off pondering upon these questions as we move into the next session. I'll be grateful for your permission to do the same.
Anushka, if I may just very briefly come in. This is Mekhila Krishnamurthy from the Center for Policy Research. I will be, it's my privilege to be a discussant in the next session, so I'll have more to say then. But I did want to say just one thing as an opening comment, just looking at the questions that have come up, that this has been designed as a conference with papers and with presentations. So I think what you'll see to the audience is that as we go through the program, there are a very rich series of papers and presentations where we sort of frame them and they've been very well curated. And so as there are so many important and interesting questions that we can ask about the present moment, like the two that have been posed. But I have a feeling this is going to be the kind of conference where if we'll have a lot to respond to based on the scholarship, the work, and the perspectives of those who are going to be presenting. So just in the spirit of engagement for the next 2 days, I really invite people to engage with the present presentations, the presenters, the papers, because the idea is also to produce a rich series of writings and volumes, which requires us to kind of engage with the material, while I think all of us will have many, I think, important questions. Many of them may not be adequately answered because of the format of the workshop. So I know I just to set expectations for everybody that this is also a gathering of scholars and practitioners and diverse sort of voices and deep scholarship on China. And of course, to open up the space for comparative thinking. So just for those who ask questions and don't get answers, I think it's not that people don't have it. I think they're all waiting to present their particular work, and I would really invite everybody to engage with that work over the next 2 days. So just to hand over to the next session.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Krishnamurthy. With that, I'd once request for the panelists for this second session to do an audio video check. I think I can hear and see Dr. Krishnamurthy well. Professor Dong Zhang, if you could hear me, could you help me out with an audio and video check yourself?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Great, thank you so much. Professor Mitra? Okay, I can see you as well. Great. I think we can begin with the next session. Dr. Ritu Agarwal, if I may request you to switch on your video camera as well.
Yes.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. I think we'll start with the section right away. Once again, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi, I warmly welcome you to the first session of the first iteration of our flagship conference on domestic governance. The conference is being organized by ICS in partnership with the Center for Policy Research, New Delhi. I, Anushka Saxena, shall be facilitating the session today. This session will be geared towards understanding the subnational or local governance in China. The speakers for this session shall present papers in tandem with the overarching theme, with this overarching theme itself. Joining us as chair for the session is Professor Subrata Mitra, who is an Emeritus Professor of Political Science at the Heidelberg University, Heidelberg, and Adjunct Professor, Dublin City University, Dublin. Joining us as speakers is Professor Zhang, who is an assistant professor at the Division of Social Science, the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, Hong Kong. The title of his paper is Top-Down Accountability, Social Unrest, and Anti-Corruption in China. Also joining us as speaker is Dr. Ritu Agarwal, who is an associate professor at the Center for East Asian Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, as well as an honorary fellow with the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. The title of her paper is Agribusiness Companies and Peasant Differentiation in China, a case study of Dounan Tower Market, Chengong County, Yunnan Province, China. Also joining us as speaker is Ambassador Kishan Rana, who is an Emeritus Fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi, as well as an Emeritus Professor at the DiploFoundation, Malta and Geneva. The title of his paper is Sub-State Delegation and Governance in China, Three Facets. Joining us as discussant for the session is Dr. Mekhala Krishnamurthy, who is a Senior Fellow at the Center for Policy Research, New Delhi, and an Associate Professor, Sociology and Anthropology, Ashoka University, Sonipat. The complete bios of our speakers can be perused in the conference brochure on our website, which is also shared on the chat box. Before we initiate the proceedings of the session, I request the audience to follow some housekeeping rules. All participants are requested to stay muted during the presentation. Questions and comments can be posted in the chat box. In fact, as our esteemed discussant highlighted, you're encouraged to post questions and comments in the chat box at any time during the event, or one can also raise their Zoom virtual hand during the interactive session. Please do unmute yourself only when called upon by the facilitator or the chair of the session to do so. The proceedings of this session will be recorded and live streamed on the ICS YouTube channel. With that, I now hand over the floor to the chair, Professor Mitra. Thank you. Professor Mitra, you're on mute.
All over again.
Thank you.
Excellencies, fellow panelists, distinguished audience, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to you all from the windswept port city of Brest in France, the extreme west of the European landmass. I am delighted as an interloper to be in this august company of specialists. Since the panelists have already been introduced, allow me a couple of minutes to explain why I consider this conference and this particular panel to be of supreme importance at the present juncture. Look, like all laymen, I've traveled in China and lectured there, but I'm not a China specialist at all, except a few lessons with Professor Manoranjan Mahanti when I was an MA student in Delhi, and subsequent interactions with Ambassador Rana, who has kindly invited me here. I have only a great admiration laced with envy for China. So why is this conference so very important? You see, we all admire China rising, expanding, achieving. And as a political scientist, I particularly wonder China holding together, not exploding, not imploding, but staying resilient. So when you ask the question as a political scientist, what explains the resilience of the Chinese state, the Chinese system, you would be surprised how quickly the question itself disappears and reappears as part of a much larger debate, no longer between China and any other country, but between two competing ideologies. We have already heard it announced at the start of this conference, a big battle between democracy and dictatorship, between liberalism and its enemies. By the time you get onto that debate, you are no longer thinking of China, you're thinking of old ideological ghosts. And the Chinese wall of incomprehension, the inscrutable China, is back again. What this conference does is to penetrate that Chinese wall and bring you down to the ground level and ask exactly what goes on. When you do that, you'll realize that regardless of what liberals say, no system can sustain itself indefinitely, entirely based on coercion. So there is some amount of accountability and accommodation in so-called dictatorships and some amount of coercion in every democracy. So what matters is the uneasy cohabitation of state and society, the linking together of and the governed. That is where this conference sheds very important light. That is for the conference as a whole. For this particular panel, it's not just the first panel, it's a flagship operation for what is to follow. This panel, in a microcosmic way, captures the essence of the macrocosm by focusing on governance. Governance is the key to sustainability, and how is it done? And in this panel, one is talking about a particular aspect of governance, which is, as you step down from the macro system, look at its components like bureaucracy, army, party, and so on, or in geographic terms, at the regional units, one has to ask, how much autonomy have they got? How much accountability have they got? And why don't they go away in their own way? What holds these units, which have to be units with some amount of presence and autonomy together? Who does it? So this who does it kind of crime story or detective story that this panel is really about. And we are singularly fortunate in having with us speakers who represent the view from within as well as view from outside. Academics who have that unsentimental lucidity which makes an academic, and practitioners who have to be accountable to knowledge as well as to real world politics. With Ambassador Rana, who bridges all these constituencies, we have a wonderful panel here. I would get started by reminding the house rules. This is not a normal presence conference where the chairman can write little notes and pass on to the speakers. So you have to have self-policing. You are allowed speakers 20 minutes each, and the discussant is allowed 15 minutes, and then the question and answer session. Write your questions directly to the speakers, and if you are putting the question in a general way, still name the speaker who should answer your question. When I think it is time, I'll give the speakers each a few minutes to respond to the questions from the floor as well as from the discussant. And I will, with your permission, reserve the last 5 minutes to sum up something like a takeaway. This is important because that would link the various panels together. And when the book comes out, that could probably become a leitmotif. So I would get started with thanks to the organizers for asking me, and also to Professor Ritu Agarwal for putting this panel together. We'll go in the order in which the speakers are mentioned. So I'll now invite Professor Zhang to take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay.
We can.
Yeah. My name is Zhang. I'm from Hong Kong University of Science Technology, and today I'm going to present a paper co-authored with Hou Linke from Shandong University in mainland China, and Liu Mingxing from Peking University. Thanks for inviting me. It's a great honor to be here to make a contribution to this conference and to reach audience in India. So today I'm going to talk about top-down accountability, social unrest, and anti-corruption in China. So I'll briefly talk about the motivation of our research, why it's important. Secondly, I'll talk about the relationship between China's performance management system and anti-corruption policies. Then I'll present some empirical results, and finally I'll briefly summarize my findings. So the motivation of our research is what motivates frontline officials to control corruption. So recent empirical studies in economics, public administration, political science, they all document that top-down anti-corruption policies, including monitoring, audits, investigation, are very effective in controlling corruption. But here, the key issue is that in reality, in the real world, political leaders, government officials, they often lack the incentive to fight corruption. They know top-down strategies will be effective, but they don't have incentive to implement those top-down strategies, especially in the developing countries. Okay, for example, in India, according to a research project led by Banerjee, who won Nobel Prize a couple years ago, in his project, he found a promising anti-corruption program, but this program faced difficulty in scaling up because this program threatened the rights of local government officials in India. So local government officials, they lobby the state government for its cancellation. So I'm not expert in India, but I learned this case from Banerjee's work. This case shows that local government officials, even they know some policies could possibly control corruption, but they don't have incentives to implement those policies. As a reason, we focus on China because in China we know that China has high levels of corruption, but at the same time, China achieved rapid economic growth in the past 4 decades. So we see a coexistence of corruption, high levels of corruption, and economic performance, good economic performance. So one explanation is that corruption in China is relatively centralized, such that the PT corruption at the grassroots level or at the local level, local government officials and the street level bureaucrats, their corrupt behaviors have largely been contained. That's one explanation. But how the question would be how do Chinese government anti-corruption initiatives translate into frontline bureaucrats' efforts on the ground through this centralized political system? And how does local bureaucracy actually work to contain petty corruption? So I think these two questions are essential for us understanding the puzzle, which the coexistence of rapid economic growth and rampant corruption. So we try to understand this question from by investigating China's performance management system. We argue that China's performance management system provides incentives for frontline officials to control corruption. Okay, in China, the difference between China and India is that China is an authoritarian regime. China, like in the absence in the absence of elections or some democratic accountability mechanisms, it's very difficult to hold government officials accountable. But here we argue that China's bureaucratic system, like top-down accountability in Chinese authoritarian regime, can hold low levels of government officials accountable to the high levels of government officials. It's top-down accountability. That can encourage those frontline officials to comply with policy goals demanded by high-level authorities. And in China's political system, performance management serves as an important instrument for high levels of officials to monitor and control local state agents, local government officials, to ensure their policy compliance. Right? If local government officials want to get promoted to higher level positions, they must comply with the policies demanded by high level authorities. It's top-down accountability. So in China's performance management system, so they have three targets in performance management. One is hard targets. Hard targets typically include economic development. And hard targets are very important for getting bonus or political rewards. Some research shows that economic growth in a region is related to the leader's promotion in the future. Soft targets, those targets include sometimes non-economic policy goals such as like party building work or propaganda or environmental protection. And third one is called veto targets. Those targets are tasks that must be completed. If a government official fail to achieve veto targets, that will cancel out all other performance. So veto targets are very important. So in China, there are like 5 layers of administration in local governance. First is province level, prefecture level, county level, township level, and the village level, right, for local governance. So today we focus on local level, like from county level to village level, right, to understand the logic of anti-corruption. So we have a unique data set. Our research is based on 3 rounds of surveys conducted by the Chinese Academy of Sciences in 2000, 2005, and 2008. So this data, we basically have like this data set covers 120 villages across 6 provinces in China. It's a national representative panel data. And the researchers, they use a stratified approach to construct a sample. First, they select 6 provinces from different regions in China. For example, Northwest, Southwest, North Central. So they select 6 provinces, and within each province, they use stratifying method to select 5 counties, and then townships, and then villages. So in total, they select 120 villages, and which are representative of other villages according to some statistical data. So this data set is very difficult to obtain. To the best of our knowledge, it is the only data set that can have like this is the only panel data that can trace villages over like 8 years, and it asks some question about performance management. It's impossible to do such kind of surveys, after in the recent 10 years, I would say. So we don't have new data, but I believe our conclusions can be applied to current period. So in our data, basically not my data, so basically my collaborators, me, Professor Liu and Professor Hou, they participated in surveys. I was not in the field at that time. So in the data, they ask, local government officials the general evaluation targets and veto targets. So for the general evaluation targets, we cannot ask like what are hard targets are, what are the soft targets are. We just ask them to select the 5 most important policy targets evaluated by, for example, we ask village leaders, village officials to select their 5 most important policy targets evaluated by township governments, their higher authorities, and ask township leaders how county level government evaluates them. And they rank their targets according to the priority in their daily work. And also the respondents were required to identify all the veto targets. So we look at some patterns. For example, in the evaluation of anti-corruption, we can say here a clear pattern is that for township to village evaluation, in the township and to village evaluation, a lot of villages, they were evaluated by their anti-corruption. Here we classify the policy target into 2 categories: top 5 general targets. That means when anti-corruption is listed as one of the top 5 targets in a village evaluation, and here when anti-corruption is listed as one of the top 5 targets in township to county to township evaluation, we can clearly see that for the township to village evaluation, we see like many villages, they were evaluated by almost half of village were evaluated by township government according to their anti-corruption performance. But for county to township evaluation, we see that county government do not care too much about anti-corruption, right? But townships care a lot about anti-corruption of village levels. Right? That's a major pattern for anti-corruption. And here, we also have data for evaluation of comprehensive management of social security. That's a term to refer to social instability. Right? So in China, it's called 社会综合治理. That's in official documents that refers to social instability. So for here, we can say for county to township evaluation, right? Almost 80% of counties they evaluate social instability in the township and in the county to township evaluations, and 60% of villages were evaluated by CMSS. But we see a trend here. Like the percentage of townships using social stability as a vital target to evaluate villages increased from about 50% to around 75%, and here from 30% to over 50%. We see a trend. That means higher level governments increasingly use social instability as a vital target to evaluate lower level governments. Okay. That's what we learned from this survey. Okay, now so we want to examine anti-corruption fulfillment at the village level, at the grassroots level. So we interview village leaders to ask them to list 5 most essential tasks they have accomplished. So if anti-corruption was one of their completed tasks in a village, so this village could be considered as to have fulfilled the anti-corruption targets. So here in the interviews, they focus on transparency and disclosure of village financial affairs. Whether village disclose the financial information to villagers, for example, the revenue of land acquisition, expenditure, reception fees, annual salaries and bonuses of village officials. If they disclose those information to villagers, then that can be considered as an anti-corruption measure in this research. So we do a.
Sorry to interrupt you, Professor. I'll be grateful if you could conclude in 4 to 5 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, 5 minutes. Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. So look, this table shows you that so the dependent variable is whether a village fulfilled anti-corruption or not. So we have some control variables, and we can see some patterns here. So that means when anti-corruption was listed as one of the top 5 targets in the township to village evaluation schemes, then we can say the village level officials, they have incentive to fulfill anti-corruption target. But if the anti-corruption was listed as vital targets, we say this is not significant, but this coefficient is positive because very few, relatively small percentage of townships, they evaluate villages as the evaluate villages for their anti-corruption targets. So the coefficient is positive, but it's not statistically significant. But when anti-corruption was listed as both a top 5 target and a vital target, we see strong effect here. That means and also statistical significance. That means when anti-corruption was listed as both top 5 target and veto target. So village strong priority. So village level officials, they have strong incentive to fulfill anti-corruption, top-down accountability. So second point I want to make is that corruption was a source of social unrest in China, because as some work shows that, so lack of transparency actually, at village level, right? So that creates a lot of problems. For example, those village carriers, they hide revenues, they fabricate expenditures, they manipulate reception fees, right? So all of those corrupt behavior are related to transparency of village financial records. And also because sometimes when the real estate developers, they seize the land of villagers, the villagers believe that they are not fairly compensated because given the large difference in price between agriculture land and commercial land. So those villagers, they launch compliance with government or government agencies. In China, we call it petitions. That's a indicator of social unrest. So when we surveys, in our survey, we ask like those villagers, the first reason for, the number of petitions, the first reason is village finance, very important. Village finance issues triggered petitions. A second of land acquisition, because it's still related to village financial issues, because people, villagers, they don't know, the price, the land price, the commercial land price, and the difference between their compensations and the market price. And they don't know, some villagers, they have collective enterprises, but they don't know the financial records of those enterprises. So corruption triggers those petitions. But did the Chinese government respond? Did villages directly respond to social unrest? Our answer is no. Here you can see our answer is like it's conditional. So we split our sample into two groups. So here you can see we classify our sample into two subsamples. In the first sample, we focus on the villagers who had resolved the petitions coercively. And the second, the other subsample, we focus on the villagers who had not resolved their petitions coercively. So we see once those villagers, they resolve those petitions coercively, once they consolidate their power at the village level, they have more incentive to fulfill anti-corruption targets. Otherwise, if the petition had not been resolved coercively, so village officials, they will worry that when you do anti-corruption, that may encourage those villages to petition, and they may undermine their authority. That may backfire. So that's conditional. And the last question we want to ask is why did local government officials prioritize anti-corruption? Why did township government select anti-corruption as a veto target and one of the top 5 targets? So here we see a pattern here. Let me briefly talk about this pattern. Here you can see our finding is that when when county level government evaluate list social instability as a veto target here for county to township evaluation scheme. In that case, township government have incentive to list anti-corruption as one of the top five targets and vital target. Okay. So that means when the county level government evaluate social instability, in response, local township level government, they evaluate anti-corruption for village levels because they believe that corruption triggers social instability at the grassroots level. Okay, let me briefly summarize my finding. So basically, we find that when anti-corruption is listed as one of the top priorities, local officials are strongly incentivized to control corruption. And anti-corruption policies do not directly respond to social instability. It's conditional on the outcome of social unrest. But we see that township level officials, they respond to county level governments. When county level government list social instability as a vital target in the county to township performance evaluation, in response, township level officials, they will prioritize anti-corruption in the evaluation of village officials. So one caveat of our finding is that this study may not be applicable to high levels of government in China, like a provincial level or city level, because as we can see in the table, high level governments, they don't care too much about anti-corruption. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor, your Indian audience has been listening to you with rapt attention and several questions have come up. You'll have a chance to respond after the discussant has made her points. I will now invite Professor Ritu Agarwal to please take the floor. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. Well, I'm very happy that my earlier speaker has already introduced the subnational government especially to the people who are new to this kind of a subnational level of local governance. So because I'll be also choosing the county level kind of a experiments regarding the land arrangements and the relationship with the peasant. So unlike what Professor Zhang has mentioned about the land acquisition and its impact on the social unrest, what I will be talking about a new kind of a social arrangements where the land has been converted into a large scale kind of an agribusiness kind of a holding, and which in a way redefine and restructure the agrarian relations between the land, peasantry, and the state. So with this larger idea in my mind, I'm going to introduce a little bit about Changpung County, because the Dounan flower market, which I'm going to talk about in my presentation, is located in the Changpung County. And maybe after the presentation, I have just 3-4 pictures I can show to you where it is and how does it look like for those who are new to this flower market. So Changpung, is located in the, of course, the Yunnan province. It's in the capital of Yunnan province, Kunming. And Yunnan is still a kind of an agrarian, agriculturally dominated province. So even to the extent that in the border trade kind of an area, most of these commodities which are constitute a major share of the border trade is basically the agrarian commodities. So it's mainly a kind of an agricultural province. And Changpung was earlier one of the county in Kunming, but later on it was become a kind of a district. So there's another story which I'm not touching upon here. The demolishing of county and becoming a district. So this is the kind of a story I'm not touching there, which actually led to the dislocation of the peasantry, or which you call the land loss peasantry. And then the whole issue is that how do the peasant population imagine their social work? So that is a point I may bring it later in contrast to the Dounan flower market, which I'm going to focus on today. And Changpung was basically mainly kind of a traditionally agrarian county, where more than 80% of its population is basically engaged in a kind of agricultural occupation. The land per capita was very limited to them. It was only 0.75 per household. And later on, after that, of course, there was a land appropriation took place because of the expansion of Untitled market later. In the till 80s, this county was basically engaged in traditional agricultural crops like maize, rice, etc. But after 1980s onwards, this county government has decided to change the cultivation into the cash crop cultivation of flowers, fruits, vegetables, and other this kind of a cash crop products. So Changkung is known for this kingdom as a kind of a natural kingdom of flowers, fruits and vegetables. So this is how it has been referred in the municipal government's websites, as well as there's a kind of a different kind of a newspaper media where it has been proposed, where it has been referred as a kind of a number one place for the flower market in Asia. So this is how it has been referred in the in various news channels and social media. And this led to a kind of a change in the land use patterns, as well as the diversification of the agrarian production. So the arable land, as you know, since there was a kind of a contestation between urbanization as well as making the land available for the agricultural occupation, and therefore this shrinkage of arable land has basically led to a change from a small scale farming to a commercial farm production. Initially, the model was either take the land on rent or take the land on lease. So basically the idea was earlier this model of renting or exchanging or leasing the land from other was basically based on the household boundaries. So it was basically limited to the boundaries within the household, because as you all know that the household responsibility system was introduced in China, where the peasant household were considered the main user right or usage of the collective land ownership patterns. But later on, what happened is that most of the farmers have invested in a specialized greenhouse cultivation kind of a product with a kind of a better technologies. And as I visited, Kunming and Changkung County, way back, I started visiting from 2002 onwards. A recent visit was 2018. One could see a kind of a huge transformation happen in this Changkung County. And the main idea was basically to increase the income of the farmers. So, Yunnan is also comparatively backward, poor province in China. So the main focus was that how to increase the farmers' income, and cash crop production became a kind of one of the important pillar of bringing kind of a transformation in this entire county government. So what county government has done, they have developed a kind of a Numa Shicha, so agriculture market, where farmers could go and sell their produce in the market. So the for the farmers, the day used to begin very early, and they used to be busy in packaging, selling the product. But in the entire process, they were also introduced to the modern means of logistics, supply, transportation, and the marketing strategies. So in a way, this availability of the market in the county nearby county was a kind of an enabling experience for the peasant, because they were also introduced to this modern marketing strategies, means of logistics, transportation, as well as supply chains, and also the scientific technological know-how. So county government have introduced a various kind of a specialized training program for the farmers so that they can achieve a special technical know-how in the cash crop cultivation. So I will skip some of these parts, because in the sense that how the production was increasing. And 80% of the population in Changkung County was basically engaged in cash crop cultivation. The county has a number of towns and villages under its administrative jurisdiction. So Dounan was town. So in that sense, Dounan, Lungchung, Bujiang, so there are all these were towns, and then there were some kind of a township. Machinpo, Tayu, Loyang, so they were all township. And the main interesting story is that after certain kind of a economic development, these towns have been administratively restructured into the urban street committee, and the township is restructured into kind of a town. So it all depends, the catching up with the urbanization, catching up with the kind of urban rescaling, how the county government actually administratively restructure all this township and other kind of areas into different designation level. And that also happened in China, in Changkung County significant ways. Let me come down to now Dounan flower market. Dounan flower market was basically it was a small street in the beginning in 1980s, where some of the farmers have taken this initiative to change their subsistence crops into this flower cultivation. But with the support of the local county government, the volume and the size of the market as well as the volume of flower transaction has expanded and grew very rapidly in China. And they were also using a different kind of advanced greenhouse technologies, which was basically used to grow these flowers, fruits, and vegetables. And they actually entered into kind of an industrial chain where the provisions of transportation, fertilizer, pesticide, cold storage also became a main important of this cash crop cultivation. So, which means that it was a completely shift from a earlier kind of a model to new model, where they have to enter into kind of a new system where they have to get access to inputs, agriculture technologies, market, the processing, transportation, cold storage facilities, etc. And with this kind of ideas, the market has also attracted the local businessmen as well as the businessmen from the other cities, provinces of China. And also, some of the farmers could become the experts in the marketing strategies, and some of became the kind of agricultural, enter into kind of this industrial chain of agro-food processing production. Now, this kind of a natural product where specialization was also not new to Yunnan. It was, in fact, since 1995, since the sixth Provincial Congress in Yunnan, they started focusing on the 18th natural commodities product. So tobacco, tea, flowers, and also some kind of other kind of the biodiversity product also were part of this pillar industries of China. So it began from 1995, and of course, all other were given much more importance by the respective local and the other governments. So 1995 onwards, when one could see that since the county government has a large amount of farmland under its control, and they were basically either expanding the land or merging the earlier existing township, or in a way trying to create a new kind of a governing capacity by creating a new market strategies. So this was, county government was involved. For example, earlier the county government has invested, good amount of financial investment, something like 38,40,000 yuan, and they created a kind of a flower transaction marketing area of 12 moon, which gradually became a kind of a specialized flower transaction market in Yunnan. Later on, they invested further money, and this flower market was expanded to almost kind of 100 mu of land. So in order to further manage this flower market, the Kunming Municipal Government's Commercial Management Department, they approved the establishment of Kunming Dounan Flower Cooperative Limited, and which began to manage the operation of the flower market in 1999. And subsequently, since 2002, the expansion and development of Dounan flower trading market became a kind of an important development strategy of provincial government. And you have the setup of Kunming International Flora Auction Trading Corporation. So, you have this system of expanding the small scale land into a large transaction market, first changing the Dounan Flower Cooperative Limited, then changing into kind of taken over by the municipal government and renamed as a Kunming International Flora Auction Trading Corporation. And then, it went on expanding. Finally, in 2009, they actually established a Dounan International Flower Industry Park. Industrial park is also very much important part of provincial government development strategies. And finally, this park was divided into the Dounan Flower Trading Market and Kunming Flower Auction Center by the Flower Management Department in Yunnan. And by 2012, the Ministry of Agriculture in China issued a document on the construction of National Dounan Flower Market. So this is story, what I try to cover is that how the county level local market has been transformed into a municipal level as a specialized market to a provincial level kind of a much more preferential market too, now referred as a kind of a national level Dounan flower market. And if you look into how many variety of flower they are growing, what kind of flower cultivation is happening, how much transaction is happening, so it's huge. and every year they claim, every 2 years, 3 years, it has been expanding. So it looks like, just to give you one idea, it looks like there was almost more than 2,000 families engaged in flower production in 2010, 11. So now it must have increased much more. And mainly the rose flower production has been expanded, and you have multiple varieties of rose flower. So look like that Changkung County was also able to invent new varieties of flowers. For example, when I was visiting, they were introducing me to the blue variety of rose flower, which was a kind of an innovation model by that specialized household in the county government. And there were flower associations, cooperatives. So yeah, so now I come to this point, that how does this agribusiness or agribusiness actually come here? In this Dounan flower market, there's a two kind of a network works: supply network and the distribution network. In the supply network, of course, you have this seeds, plants, fertilizers, farms, etc., and the growers basically. And the distribution network basically transfer the flowers to the consumers. And all these participants, unlike Dounan, of course, became the major important base. But apart from Dounan, you have other places in Yunnan as well. For example, Yushi, Hungha, Lijiang. Chungtian, Chujing, Paoshan. They also, have been specializing in growing different kind of a flower, as well as different kind of a, models of varieties of flower industry. Now, I come to this agro industries part, in the sense, what are the flower enterprises and how do they work? So if you look at entire Yunnan, of course, there's a multiple kind of enterprises which are engaged in a multiple kind of product, vegetables, mushroom, tea, coffee cultivation. So it has basically limited to the natural product. But if you look at flower, especially, so for example, one has this Yunnan Yunshu Flower Cooperative Limited. I'm just giving you one example, which was established in 2009, and it is located in a Yushi city. So it was, it was a high-tech enterprises, a provincial leading enterprise in Yunnan, which is basically integrated with the promotion as well as production and the sale of fresh cut, roses or fresh cut roses flowers. So company was known as a, earlier, Tunghai County Yunshu Rose Professional Cooperatives. And this cooperative was established in 2006. But after that, since they were expanding their base, so they were basically earlier engaged with the agriculture material, technology, packaging, branding, sales, etc. Initially, something like 530 households have joined this cooperative, and the planting area has reached more than 1,000 moon. And they claim that the annual production and the sale of this fresh cut rose flower was more than 50 million. But in order to better serve the farmers, later on, this cooperative limited was renamed as a Yunnan Yunshu Flower Cooperative Limited. So it was changed from one person name to provincial level cooperative limited. And they adopted this model of, what is the model? Company, cooperative, base, and farmers. So farmers work in a kind of a given base, which is basically a greenhouse cultivation. And then it is formed under a cooperative, and then cooperative goes to this, the larger base of this company. So these kind of models are very much there. Yeah, Anushka, I know 5 minutes is there, and you have a various kind of new varieties, Chinhui, Chinian, Mangmei, and etc. So this I can come to it later, but let me come to the main point now. So how do we understand the relation between the land, peasant, and the state after telling all these stories? To simply say that small scale peasant land holding, people have lost interest in that because of all these reasons. I'm giving you examples that you need to have a kind of expertise in seeds, inputs, technologies, and marketing strategies. And since the small holders don't have all this expertise, so they're losing a kind of enthusiasm to be engaged in a small scale kind of peasant farming. So that is a foregone conclusion that China is overall going for a large scale land transfer. But what I'm going to, what I was thinking and I'm going to talk about is that, this new practice of land pool, which has happened in China in a significant way, especially in Dounan flower market, one doesn't see any kind of a resistance, happening here. So the reason may be, which I thought, because of the socialist era, earlier people have this idea of course, individual peasant holding, but later on you have a collective, then you have a commune, and finally you don't have a control over the land. So this, historical experience of not owning the land holding, individually. Rather, it was basically owned by the collective and the cooperative. So that systematically works well somewhere in the mind of the peasant in Dounan market as well. Only satisfaction was that they are working on their land. So the one set of example is that urbanization, where peasants have lost their land and they feel completely strange in the new kind of a setting. So there is a resettlement colony, for example, and in a settlement colony, they have been put under the apartment. And this apartment, they feel completely different, completely strange. But in this kind of a Dounan flower market, the farmers still work on their land. So the land belongs to them, but they are not tied to the land. So, you have this new idea of a peasantry, which is not tied to the land. So you have Nungmin. But if you talk to Chinese peasant, they will also still call them that Nungmin. I mean, we are peasant. But they are no longer born to be, or they are no longer in a position to be, or they are no longer in a condition to be tied to the land, but they have this satisfaction that they are working on the land. So they are not dislocated from their known surroundings as well as known environment. So that is the one point which came to our mind. Therefore, it has been accepted so widely. I mean, local government, of course, played a very important role in terms of, promoting this idea of efficient, modern, and developed agriculture. But the way it has been accepted widely by the peasant all over China is not simply, at least in Yunnan, it's not simply the case of, land holding doesn't pay you so much, it doesn't, return back. Rather, I would say the whole idea that you are no longer want to be tied to the land. You want to be free. So there's a kind of a freeing of, identity where you don't want to be work on the land any longer. Rather, you want to be engaged in a different kind of a livelihood strategies, either as an entrepreneurial farmer, as a contract farmer, as a proletarian farm worker, as a wage worker. So there's a different kind of a differentiation which people have talked about has emerged in China. So land has become a pool kind of a thing, which is not new to Chinese peasantry. Second question, which come to our mind is that it works like a, enabling option, as I said, because, peasants have been introduced to these technologies, training skills, marketing strategies. But how sustainable it is, of course, that remains a question, because peasant income may have increased to some extent. But the global market, where they are catering to, may keep, fluctuating. So sometimes prices go up, sometimes prices go down. So how this, they are going to respond to this kind of a global market strategies, it also becomes a kind of a challenge. So that, right, in the sense that they are included in the sense of, knowing about the new technologies, but excluded because the global market is not under their control. And how sustainable it is, because income may remain high for some time, but it depends in the sense, suppose there's a kind of some pest attack, then agro companies may not able to pay for it. So how feasible the contract is between the agribusiness companies and the farmers, and how much local government are able to mediate between these companies and farmers, the entire, reliability that the farmers have to, be responding to these companies. They have to give their product to the, to the company as well, because unlike tobacco, the flowers don't have monopoly in the market. Tobacco companies, of course, have their monopolies in the market. So the farmers cannot sell their tobacco outside, but the flowers can be sold outside. So, and the third last point is that there seems to be kind of a viable option between the bargaining position between the administrator, which is local government, user, which is the peasant household, and the, the collectives. So they have found a kind of a bargaining position in the sense that nobody will have a complete control over the land through this emerging rental markets in China. Okay, just let me share, the 1 minute, if, I can, just 2-3 photographs to just tell the, audience how the flower market looks like in China. So this is a kind of a greenhouse cultivation in massive scale in China, mainly of roses. This is the flower market, which is the industrial park, Dounan Industrial Park. They have recently been upgraded to. You see, like, in the amount of transition which is happening, a significant base because of the closer proximity to Kunming. Also, we have the urban consumers are going in a significant base. So full of packaging, rosing, and this is a Dounan Huai Zhang, the industrial park which they have been. Yeah, one more last point which I was so surprised that because looking at the success of Dounan flower market, Yunnan Financial, this university has started Dounan International Flower as a vocational course in the financial university in Yunnan. So anyway, so they are very optimistic about this entire success stories of Dounan. Yeah, with this, I conclude and I will come back to it later.
Thank you very much, Professor Agarwal. I've immensely enjoyed your paper and actually written you a question already in the chat box. You'll hear it. I will now invite Ambassador Rana to please take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. I came into this panel by accident. There was a professor who was to be the third speaker, but could not join us. And I kind of volunteered. So I paid the price for being keen. I want to talk about three subjects. The role of provinces in foreign affairs in China. Second, the very unusual system of leading small groups. Some may not even have heard of them. They're not terribly well known. And the third is knowledge management, particularly in the sense of continuing education of officials. My first point, provincial role. China has 33 provincial entities. 22 are provinces, and there is Taiwan. We will leave Taiwan out of the reckoning for now. There are 5 autonomous regions, 4 municipalities, which are treated as provinces. That's Beijing, Shanghai, Chengdu, and Tianjin, sorry. And there are the 2 special autonomous regions, that is Hong Kong and Macau, making a total of 33. Now, in all of these, the Foreign Ministry co-runs something called a Foreign Affairs Office. This is funded by the province, by the provincial entity, but it is under the tight control of the Foreign Ministry in Beijing. It's a very unique system. As far as I know, no other country has a system quite like this. And the Foreign Affairs offices are given fairly broad responsibilities, particularly if they happen to be on the border. Yunnan, which I visited the Foreign Affairs office. It had more than 100 people, and it was responsible for dealing at a local level with Laos and Myanmar. Of course, they don't deal with the central government in these countries, they deal with the local authorities. But there is always something or the other happening with the local authorities that needs discussion, that needs dialogue. And as they said candidly, Beijing is very far. If there is a local problem, we have to deal with it. And of course, inform Beijing immediately about what's happening. They're also responsible for the maintenance of boundary pillars, etc., which is kind of routine work. Now, the interesting thing about this method is that they act in a way that is particularly vigorous when it comes to economic diplomacy. In terms of attracting FDI into China, sending out business delegations, trade delegations, export delegations, it is the provinces that take the lead. And of course, it's done under the tight supervision of the Foreign Ministry. Some provinces even have offices nested within Chinese embassies. Yunnan province, which is very close to India geographically, actually had an office in Beijing. Perhaps it's closed down now, I'm not sure. But again, it's a system that operates in a unified, centralized fashion, but with clear delegation of responsibilities to the provinces. It runs beautifully because of the central nature of power, the central nature of discipline and control that operates both through the state apparatus and even more through the party apparatus. If we compare it with India, we find that it's actually the Modi government that has taken some very interesting initiatives. I wrote an article in this, published in EPW, and it will be included in my paper, the reference I mean. The Modi government established a states division in the Indian Ministry of External Affairs, a first. And a few MEA offices have been opened in states, but it's a limited number. I think there are at present maybe 7 or 8 of these offices. It's not a very big number compared with the number of states we have. But the other interesting thing is that foreign ministry officials at the rank of ambassador volunteer to act as a friend on behalf of a particular Indian state. So you may have India's ambassador to Uzbekistan, to whom is allocated the state of Odisha, or whatever. But that official is responsible for helping that state government, not only in relation to his or her particular job at a point in time, but to act as a friend and ally to the state in reaching out to external markets. I think it's a brilliant idea. It's a fine way of getting states involved in a guided, I would say, not just involved, guided into reaching out to states, reaching out to the external market. I won't say too much more about this, and I'll go on to the leading small groups, which is really a fascinating kind of animal. I call it animal because it's a system that really has no parallel that I've heard of anywhere. Firstly, very little is known about the leading small groups. The membership is never published. You will read a newspaper account somewhere that the leading small group dealing with Taiwan or dealing with foreign affairs or national security or internet governance, for example, held a meeting. But you know nothing more about it because you don't know who are the members. What is its role? It amounts to a centralized way of looking at particular priority issues in different fields. And there are something in the region of 50 to 60 leading small groups. They appear and they disappear from time to time. Some are created for a specific purpose and then they are closed down. And some hibernate and then come into action if need arises. So what does the leading small group do? They are headed by the topmost personalities of China. Xi Jinping personally heads somewhere in the region of 5, 6, 8 leading small groups, and other members of the Standing Committee of the Politburo, and there are only 7 of them, including Li Keqiang, Prime Minister, he heads some, and so do the others. So it is top-level scrutiny of particular issues. Membership, they include ministers, they include party officials, they include PLA officials, provincial leaders, and all manner of people, including professors, including specialists. They meet from time to time, but they have a permanent secretariat headed by a senior party official who collates information on the issues being tackled by the leading small group. And the leading small group, its activities, which are completely behind a dark screen, we know that there is a process of information transmission from the bottom up to the topmost leadership of the country. How do we know anything about this? Well, Hong Kong is a wonderful place, used to be, perhaps still is, for gathering information. And in 2010, the Swedish Institute of Peace and International Studies, SIPRI, was given the privilege of carrying out a detailed examination of the operation of the leading small group on foreign affairs. So that is how we have got to know something of how these LSGs function. Today, what's happened under President Xi Jinping is that there is a kind of centralization of power that's taken place. It's not for nothing that he is called the chairman of everything. He is now the chairman of something called the Central Commission on Foreign Affairs. So the leading small group has morphed into a central commission. Now, China does not easily experiment with structures. It shares it in common with Germany. These are two countries I know, and maybe Japan as well, which do not easily build or create new structures. Now, the beauty of this system is that I suppose they can only be selective. They can only look at X number of issues. But in relation to those issues, there is a top-level scrutiny of the implementation of policy. There is feedback from the lowest levels on how the policy is actually working and what are the changes that may be necessary to make that policy work better.
Yeah.
As a system of governance, I think it is absolutely brilliant. Now, interestingly, Prime Minister Modi has done something that has a conceptual similarity to this. Mind you, you remember, previous governments had set up something that was called groups of ministers, GOMs for short. I believe at one point we had 70 of these, and nobody knew what they were doing. Because, of course, there is no accountability. Ministers meet, they talk, they disagree, and they go away. So nobody knows what's actually happened. There is no secretariat, there is no follow-up, and there is no feedback loop to the top leadership, which for India would mean the Prime Minister of India. Well, in a systemic manner, the top leadership knows what's going on. I'm afraid that doesn't happen in India. So what Prime Minister Modi did was, he set up, you remember, it was widely written up around 2015, 16, a certain number of problem areas, problem projects were identified. The Prime Minister's office and the Niti Aayog worked very hard in gathering information, and the top officials of each project met in a video session to relate to the Prime Minister why the project was blocked. Now, you can imagine in the Indian system, the very fact that your project was selected for presentation to the Prime Minister meant that you would be shaking in your shoes because you did not want all your inaction to be exposed. It was a fine way for New Delhi to try and enforce accountability in a system that does not have the instruments of direct manifestation of discipline of the kind that China has, thanks to its party system, thanks to its tightly regulated, centralized system. We simply don't have that. And we don't have it, we don't have it. There's no point in saying, oh, but they do this job in a much better way. Maybe they do, and maybe they have other problems that we don't know about. Because frankly, as I said, the working of the leading small groups is not widely known. And we know very little of what actually goes on. And that's my second big point. My third big point, and incidentally, I plan to finish in 15 minutes. So, Anushka, please be strict with me. If I approach 13 minutes, warn me, because I may get carried away. I wanted to save 5 minutes extra for the chair so that the chair gets better time for a summing up. My third point is about continuing education as an aspect of knowledge management. China has these party schools. Do you know how many? 2,700 party schools function across the country. They are run at the central level, the provincial level, the prefecture level, the county level, etc. And of course, the townships, etc., etc. 94 million Chinese are members of the CCP. So it's a huge expansion compared with the past. This really means that out of adults, roughly 1 in 10 is a party member. And I'm told that actually it's not easy to become a party member. You have to go through a fairly rigorous screening process. But the present government, the present leader, Xi Jinping, has, in a calculated way, expanded the party. Every party member must go to a party school every 5 or 6 years. That's obligatory. And going to a party school is not exactly like going to a party, because the party school will catch hold of you and drill things into your head for 3 to 6 months. And they have a power to fail you. And when they fail you, consequences follow. Every official who receives a significant promotion must attend party school, again for 3 to 6 months. Provincial governors are required to go to the party school together with their senior most staff, and they attend for 3 months. And they have to pass. If they don't pass, promotions will not go into effect. And it's as simple as that. What do they do at the party school? Let's look at the Central Party School located in Beijing. It has 600 faculty, of whom 160 are full professors. It carries out research, it carries out all manner of training, runs a series of courses, and they also invite a significant number of foreign lecturers and speakers. They have the money for...
Sorry to interrupt you, Ambassador. If you could conclude in 4 minutes.
Okay,
yeah, 3 to 4 minutes.
I will, 3 minutes, okay, I will wind up. So, the point is that in India, we actually have done something slightly similar. In 2009, it was decided that at every promotion of a significant level, Deputy Secretary to Director, Director to Joint Secretary to Additional Secretary, everybody must undergo training for about 6 weeks. This is left to each ministry, to each entity to enforce. But for the first time, India introduced this method. Now, there is much more that can be done in terms of training. And there is, I suppose, much more that even China can do. Because in the courses that they run in China, at the Central Party School, for example, and this applies to the others also, there is tight focus on ideological training. Well, that's a very Chinese thing to do. But there is also a great deal of focus on what's happening in the West to understand international affairs, international economy, social trends, etc., etc. But I don't see any reference to any effort to understand what's happening in the global South. And I have an impression that this is an area in which China doesn't really pay enough attention. But that's only my surmise. I think I will stop here because I do want to leave time for others, particularly for the chair and of course for questioners. Thank you very much for giving me the chance to unburden myself on 3 issues which are genuinely of interest to me and about which I don't think there is enough research or study carried out around the world and least of all in India. Thank you very much.
Ambassador, thank you for those 15 minutes of precision, concision, and comprehension. I would have listened to you much longer, but there'll be other opportunities. Thank you very much. Now I'll call on our speaker, our discussant, Dr. Mekhala Krishnamurthy, to take the floor.
Thank you so much, Professor Mitra. It's a great pleasure to finally meet you. Your recent book on the Ministry of Home Affairs is on my bookshelf here. And it's really a pleasure to meet and to be chaired in this session by you. And thank you very much to all three of the presenters. I do want to, make one preliminary comment in that I think Ambassador Rana, you said you were the last person into this panel, but you were the one person who sent in written comments for me to engage with. The other two, I have not seen papers. So I am going to respond on the basis of the presentations. And therefore, hopefully in the spirit that the full papers will take on some of these questions and explain, things in a little bit. So there'll be some questions and some suggestions for engagement. But I think they're really rich and exciting papers to get the conference going, but also to get us thinking around this question of the subnational, the regional, the provincial, and its engagements with the world, right? With the nation and the world in the context of China. I'm also sort of very conscious that this is not yet, and I think the spirit of engagement of the discussants is to think a little bit comparatively, but this is not a set of papers that are intentionally meant to be comparative. And so with that understanding, I would still encourage, I think particularly the first two papers, to take a little bit of effort in the full papers to describe some of the terms and the discussions, because I think a lot of the readers, certainly Indian readers, will have a great deal to gain. And I'm thinking about even words like targets and veto targets. It's a very interesting term. Its history, what it means, it sounds fascinating. The idea that a veto target is something you have to meet. But the word veto, what does it mean? How does one think about it? Or the meaning of a petition. I think there was a question also raised about how, what is a coercive petition? How is it resolved coercively? But also the petition itself, right? The act of petitioning. So I think, and in the case again, Dr. Agarwal, of your paper, there are just so many terms in the administrative reformations that you're grappling with that are so interesting and complicated. And I think, again, Ambassador Rana, you mentioned terms, as you said, leading small groups. It'll become an acronym quickly in the paper. But for us to be able to establish a visual and administrative sense of what we are talking about, so that we might both understand China better, but also make the right kind of comparisons. Because sometimes the term, like a petition, may sound similar. It may sound familiar, or a target may sound familiar to Indian readers. But I think the particular meaning of it in terms of its legal status, its administrative status, its social power, and its social status may be quite different. And therefore, understanding, I think you've got a difficult job. I think all the paper writers have a difficult job of allowing us to understand China better, and then allowing us to do this comparative work. And so I would just encourage that sort of depth of detailing as you write the papers. Let me also say, as a member of the Center for Policy Research, we have two initiatives: the Accountability Initiative, which was founded in 2008, and more recently in 2019, the State Capacity Initiative. And so for us, many of our colleagues and our research associates are here listening in. This is a deeply rich work and important work, because we are so interested in understanding accountability and in understanding different kinds of things, thinking about bureaucratic and state capacity. So, and along with that, we're very interested in the question of the state and the market, right? And the kind of capacity that the state has to both shape, regulate, and engage with markets. And I think your paper was exactly, looking and grappling with this question of local economic development, the state and the market. So I know many colleagues of ours will be deeply interested in the work that you're doing. So with that, let me just, quickly leap into some quick thoughts. I think the framing of Zhang, your paper, looking at top-down accountability, the question of frontline bureaucrats and incentives is really, really interesting. It's really important. Certainly in India, we spend a lot of time thinking about what to do about discretion. And I found it really interesting, Ambassador Rana, there's another way that you're looking at discretion in terms of deliberation and decision making, very different from the kind of bad discretion that the first paper talked about. And often when we think about state and local governance, we spend a lot of time thinking about bad discretion. We spend a lot of time thinking about corruption. We don't spend a lot of time actually thinking about the issues you raised at the end: training, knowledge management, capacity, deliberation, decision-making of certain kinds. We think a lot about how to control, especially frontline bureaucrats, right? And I was curious because, whenever we talk to frontline bureaucracy in India, which is often also painted with this problem of being deeply corrupt, the problem that they talk about is the obsession with the wrong kind of discretion when it comes to the lower bureaucracy, and the fact that a lot of corruption is in fact centralized, and we focus so much on petty retail corruption, and we don't pay enough attention to that. So here you actually presented an inversion where you said, when you were quoting Pradhan Bardhan, that the assumption is that there isn't a lot of retail or petty corruption in China. And I wanted to ask you, is that the sense, the public sense, right? Because then it sounded like in the latter part of the paper, the focus was on petty corruption, right? On provincial corruption or village leaders corruption. So is that understanding, that external understanding, that petty corruption is not as big a problem in a country like China, is that not the way in which people think about it? That they actually do think that village level corruption, you mentioned the lack of transparency of financial accounts. Certainly in India, we have had not just the right to information in recent times, but many states have taken on the task of producing social audits. So we have a very extensive social auditing and grievance redressal mechanism that has now been put into place, with many, many associated challenges. But I was wondering whether the incidence of petitions and the kind of social expression of the problem of corruption is something that then is discernible. So is this assumption that they are not so corrupt at the local levels, then something that at least the Chinese public would not agree with, right? And would find something quite important to focus on. So that was one overall, question that I wanted to ask. I would love a classification of targets, hard targets, soft targets, veto targets, some more description of what they are. Like, what are the concrete examples? You mentioned a few, but for example, soft targets went from propaganda on the one hand to environmental compliance on the other. And I was wondering, do the two fit together as soft targets? Or, is environmental compliance and propaganda somewhat similar? Or how does one classify these targets, and what they are in detail? So that is something that was, coming to my mind. And then I finally wanted to ask this question about, if I understood your paper right, one of the things you were saying was that from townships to village, there is a lot of interest and focus on corruption and accountability for anti-corruption activities. But when you look at a little higher level, from county to township, you see much more of focus on social unrest and less on accountability for anti-corruption. So I just, it would be great to hear you actually theorize that difference, right? Why, or analyze why is that the case? Is it that it's easier to pinpoint anti-corruption at the local level? Is social unrest what is given to the higher levels to kind of cope? And then the point you are making, which is a more complicated one, which is that corruption itself, or anti-corruption, which is sort of petitioning and raising these questions, is seen as a kind of social unrest, right? So I just an invitation to be more analytical about that last part, because your findings are very interesting, but just getting some sense of what you think explains those kinds of findings in the context of China. And then I think some sort of social and sociological classification of these targets and the examples. So, the process of petitioning, who generally petitions, etc. So we'd be very, very interested to hear that. Let me, turn to, Ritu, your paper, which, as I work on agricultural mandis and agricultural markets in India, and have been tracing their regulatory biographies for a rather long time. So it's really, really interesting. I think many of the questions that you've raised and the dynamics that you've posited are of deep interest to countries like India, but also a larger global conversation about consolidation, agro-commercial capital, the relationships between farmers, business, the state, and agro-commercial context. I would just, again, just an invitation to maybe, take the administrative story that you mentioned really seriously as well. So in some ways, your paper has two stories. You end with this larger question about, the terms of engagement, the political economy of peasant and the state, and, what happens when you actually have land pooling and consolidation. But just to encourage you to think a little bit actually about the core story analytically. Like, what does it mean to keep changing administrative status, right? And you asked a very interesting question about why things have not been contested. And one of the very interesting things, I think, in agricultural markets is that often really deep reform happens via administrative shifts in commercial relations, which people are not always very aware of, right? And the farm laws and the recent huge debate over agricultural marketing law in India was one of the rare moments where agricultural law became the subject of public contestation. Most of the time, Mandi acts and these, regulatory acts are the subject of local resistance, because only people at the local level, actually, usually traders, are the ones who experience the kind of changes that you're doing, right? But here you're talking about a series of very interesting infrastructural but administrative and regulatory transformations: flower markets, flower cooperatives, for auction trading companies, industrial parks, auction. So, and then the move from county, municipal, provincial, and national. And the reframing of a national market is, again, something that is, deeply debated right now in India. Like, what does a national agricultural market actually look like? So it's an invitation to say, while you're raising very big questions at the end, which I think all of us know are vital, which is about the terms of engagement that farmers have with the state and with capital, you have a very dense, interesting institutional governance story about agricultural law and also about commercial regulatory practice and administrative structure and organizational forms that would be really interesting, because often the battle happens there, in a very mundane, these small transformations, right, are really, really important. So just, there. And then finally, Ambassador Rana, just such a interesting set of things. I think, again, there are 3 possible papers there when you're looking, and I see Nimi has put in a comment, I haven't read it yet, but on foreign policy and the idea of, provincial engagement in economic diplomacy. And then you have the second one, which was really fascinating, on leading small groups. And then finally one on training. And I wanted to ask a question, and maybe that's something that your paper could take on as you bring these 3 together. One of my visits to, in Yunnan, it was very interesting. We were talking about this democracy versus centralization and authoritarian things. And a person, one of the senior members of said to me there, he said, look, because we all fall in line eventually in China, we have a lot more deliberation than you think. The problem with all of his contestation, the problem with India, was that we contest the policy politically after the policy has come. Whereas they contest and form and refine policy prior to it, because after it's come, you have to fall in line anyway, right? But I was working through this idea of leading small groups, for example, or thinking about the fact that they have secretariats and that so much is subjected to internal, it's not just a political implementation, but how does one deal with the fact that, eventually there will be a lot of compliance? So what is the room for deliberative capacity and decision-making capacity. And if you think about questions of training, it is administrative and technical, but knowledge management, learning, but also this leading small groups. I mean, one thing that struck me very interestingly from what you said was secretariats. In our recent work in India, repeatedly people have talked about how we do not build secretariats into our deliberative mechanisms. So nobody does the research, nobody does the follow-up. And of course, in the present moment, we also see that many mechanisms of committees and other things are being used less effectively. So this whole question of, how does one actually build to purpose these kinds of mechanisms, and whether there's a larger question about, the possibility of deliberation and knowledge exchange and even contestation within these systems internally, or is that not the case? And maybe I'm, again, one is being a little sanguine about that possibility. But it was raised to me, and it struck me in your examples, it's not about whether we should follow or not follow, but it's interesting to see as a process in terms of accountability and in terms of outcomes. Do we see a richer internal deliberation than we are often observing externally? And whether that's good enough, of course, is a larger question. But so thank you very much. I really enjoyed listening to the three presentations. I learned a great deal. Very much look forward to reading the final papers.
That was a wonderful, spirited set of comments. I have greatly appreciated them. I would now like to open the floor for a question and answer session. We don't have a lot of time left. If people have questions, now is the time to ask. If not, I would ask, do I see any hands up? I don't see any hands up. So maybe we could have a little recap of the questions that we have got in the chat box. Would you read them out?
Yes, of course. May I go ahead?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll begin with the questions and comments addressed to Professor Zhang. So we first have a comment from Nimi Kurian from CPR, in which she says that I think when one looks at what motivates frontline officials, top-down accountability is likely to present only half the story. Precisely given that social stability is a critical policy goal, I think we need to factor in the role that informal accountability at the village level in China has played in holding local officials accountable. Lily Tsai's work on the role of solitary institutions such as lineage groups could offer interesting takeaways. This is quote unquote. So thank you for that comment. We have two questions addressed to Professor Zhang Dong. The first one is, what does it mean for a petition to be resolved coercively? And the second one is from Professor Rajdeep Pakanati, and it is, in the changed circumstances of very limited access to visit China to undertake research, how can researchers interested in Chinese domestic governance pursue their research? And then there is a third question that has been addressed to all speakers, which is that the authoritative direction, corruption, and propaganda are the pillars of the Chinese society. It all boils down to grassroots sufferers. Any idea of the kind of resentment, happy or unhappy in percentage terms among the farmers or the general public due to the above mentioned factors? So if Professor Zhang Dong would like to answer those questions.
No, please raise all the questions, because then I'll give a few minutes to each speaker and we might be running out of time. I've just sent a message to Ambassador Rana to know if we could go over time by a few minutes. But anyway, please group the other questions, then the speakers will come on. Okay.
Sure, sir. Then there are three questions for Dr. Ritu Agarwal. One is by the chair himself, who starts by making a comment that I was amazed to be able to buy Chinese ginger and garlic, far better quality than the Indian variants, in a little shop in the JNU campus. So how does this work, and do global value chains operate in the Chinese agricultural market? The second question is from Professor Usha Chandran, who asked Dr. Agarwal, have you also focused on the gendered composition of the farmers? As is evident in the pictures, it seems that they're mostly manned by women. So how are there many women farmers, or are the families collectively involved in farming? And then the third question is by Professor Pakanati, the same question posed to Professor Zhang. In the changed circumstances of very limited access to visit China to undertake research, how can researchers interested in Chinese domestic governance pursue their research? And finally, for Ambassador Rana, we have one question from Raj Gupta, which is Central Cyberspace Affairs Commission and Central Financial and Economic Affairs Commission of China. Both have stemmed from an LSG in 2018. Now, both are being chaired by President Xi, which indicates greater centralization. How do you see these two transformations? Do you think one can conclude that the leading small groups are somewhat loose versions of central commissions with lesser authority and lesser centralized power as compared to the central commission? That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Friends, in the interest of time management, I have made a hugely self-serving decision that I will not be able to give the speakers an opportunity to come back now, but please remember, a volume is being planned out of this conference. So please remember your questions, and when you rewrite your papers, please take them into account. My apologies for not being able to give you the time, because I really must. I promised Ambassador Rana to make a few comments, by the way, of a takeaway from this panel, because otherwise the conference might not quite reach its objective, which is to reach out to three constituencies. What have we learned about the theory of governance? What have we learned about how governance actually works inside China? And how much of it is up for grabs for India, which would be consistent with the Indian constitution, so that there can be a flow of knowledge? And can there also be a return flow? Like, do we only have to be obedient pupils, or can we also teach? What is it that they should know and they don't know about India, and how can it flow? So on each of these 3 points, let me make very quick comments. Now, governance works when things are done according to the norms set by the political system. This is what we have seen in practically all the papers, that a system works in China because of the incentivization of the rules. The question that has not been answered is, what are the incentives? Do people work mostly for their salaries and pensions, or do they also work because it is important for its own sake? Are there moments in China when people come up with the question, not what China can do for you, but what you can do for China? Is ideology an incentive? And if it is an incentive, how does it work? So that is, by the way, of the theory of governance. I have learned a lot by looking at China, which is a different kind of system from India, because the comparison of two very different systems helps you to get above the two systems and look at both of them in terms of something much higher, which is people are people everywhere, and they would be governed only if it is to their interest to be governed. And ideology might become an incentive when you reach a stage where you can say, I should do this because China wants me to do it, because it is important for my grandchildren to do it. So that one thinks in the long term. On what do we know about how governance operates within China? I have said right at the outset that the main objective of this conference is to break through that wall of incomprehension that separates China from the rest of the world. In the old days, China used to be known as a closed society about which one knew very little, or the inscrutable Chinese, or the Mao smile when I was a student in Delhi. How much of China has been made transparent to us because of these papers and the other papers to follow. How much of it can come across? This is where I learned a lot from the way the land market operates in China. First of all, one doesn't think of a land market. One doesn't even think of a market. One doesn't think of monetization as an interest. So the question is, how does China work in terms of pushing through land reform where India fails too? The problem of democracy, I've written elsewhere, is that democratic elections can handle issues within the system, but not issues of the system. Now, this is where maybe the Chinese example of how to incentivize reform can be of some interest to India. Now, finally, I come to the issue of knowledge flow. I've already mentioned that we learned it from Ambassador Rana's paper, that they don't seem to be particularly well informed about the global south. I was wondering why not. Now, what is the incentive? Normally in life, we look up. We want to learn from those who are ahead of us. When I was lecturing in Tsinghua, I was amazed how much the students already knew about Germany and they wanted to know more, and how little they knew really about what makes Indian democracy work. What is the juxtaposition of separation of powers and division of powers and countervailing forces which makes Indian elections a reality? So maybe we have also an opportunity to share some knowledge with our Chinese colleagues and compatriots. The question that remains unanswered, of course, is not just that there are party schools, but what is taught in those party schools? Is it only professional knowledge about foreign systems, about science and technology, or does ideology play a role in the syllabus? Do people learn something about, well, a kind of watered down version of Maoism, or a sense of solidarity with the whole system? What I want to know is, how does Marxism, Leninism, Maoism operate at the level of incentivizing the civil servants? This is a question I would have liked to take up with Professor Tong. Is coercion the only means of compliance, or is ideological incentivization also a tool of compliance in China? I think I'm going to get into trouble now. We have had a wonderful conversation, a very great start to a great conference, and I would like to thank you all for your attention, and I look forward to reading that book which will come out of this conference. So thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Professor Mitra. I'm afraid as we ran out of time, we won't be able to entertain the questions, but yes, I would like to reiterate the sentiments expressed by the chair when I say that the speakers should definitely try to address these questions in their final papers. So thank you so much. With this, we come to the end of session 1 of the first conference on domestic governance. I express my sincere gratitude to the chair, discussant, and speakers for their remarks and for patiently addressing the questions and comments posed by the audience. I also express my sincere gratitude to the audience for interacting with the speakers and for tuning into this session. We at ICS have a robust schedule planned for day 1 and 2